Alexander Ivanovich, you've just presented a series of facts and summarized them. In the source references, you provided the dates they became known. Mostly, these facts came to light after the year 2000. So, it turns out that such information becomes public and available for analysis 25 to 30 years after the actual events. Is that correct?
You're absolutely right. Thank you.
And between the early 2000s and now, had anyone else analyzed this information, or are we now witnessing the premiere of such a synthesis?
I see two parts here. First, what has been done, and second, who did it first. Let's talk about what has been done. Yes, at the time, we knew nothing of this. Personally, I don't see anything blameworthy about that. Let me first speak to the men here who've read memoirs about various military victories. For example, Napoleon won at Austerlitz. Did he talk about how many soldiers he lost? No. When there is a victory, who talks about the losses? The victory speaks for itself. For instance, the first docking was accomplished. I spoke about the burning spacecraft. But it landed safely. The engineers raised a toast to the fact that it returned safely. Some conclusions are drawn. That's standard. We do it, and so do the Americans. I often mention intelligence officer Ivanov from the Pacific Fleet. He said, "We observed U.S. military exercises. We personally saw two fighters crash into the sea near an aircraft carrier. The next day, nothing. The exercise was declared a success. This is quite typical. But if you're entering into an agreement for a joint flight, then sorry, the approach changes. I support secrecy and think it's the right policy. Of course, we didn't know about all of this at the time, and it was only disclosed, with a reasonable level of secrecy, 20 or even 30 years later. At the time, we were unaware. Now, as for who conducted this analysis first, honestly, I don't think that's very important for this conversation. I did it simply because I hadn't seen it done anywhere else. I can add that perestroika gives the mind plenty of free time to work, for the simple reason that no one's paying for your main job anymore. So, you find time for analysis. Specialists from an industrial city Korolyov, given the closed status of the city and of the institutions located there, are familiar with this kind of data. It interested them. But on the other hand, when you're caught up in daily responsibilities, there's no time for statistics or big-picture thinking. You just have to get the job done. An outside perspective is needed. Maybe that was my advantage.
Thank you for the answer. Before we move on to the second part, let's try to explain the potential consequences of increasing docking speed using simple analogies. What happens if the approach speed in space 50 years ago increases from, say, 30 centimeters per second to 40? That's a 1/3 increase.
I'd suggest another approach. Let's analyze what happens when the speed is reduced. What are the benefits?
From 30 centimeters to 20.
To 10.
To 10. That's a threefold difference.
Ninefold.
Yes, squared it's 9 times. So, what happens then? As you rightly noted, in all cases where someone independently increased the docking speed, there were impacts. Most of us here drive cars. When there's a minor accident, the report usually notes hidden damage possible. And quite often that's true. You go to a repair shop and they do find something. You could make an analogy. During dockings that deviated from standard procedures or calculated speeds, there were mechanical impacts that caused the very effects we later saw in the statistics.
You know, I support that point of view. The only thing is, I'd be careful using the word standard when talking about that early period. At that time, they were still figuring out what a standard docking should even be. It was already clear to everyone, and remains so today, that the softer the contact, the better. Let's approach from a kilometer away at 1 centimeter per second. But how much fuel would that require? Fuel consumption, control precision, these were the challenges. They were searching for the optimal balance. And most importantly, even if back then someone had said, dock at 10 centimeters per second, I think many engineers would have replied, we can't achieve that. Our engines aren't precise enough, our automatic systems and computer control aren't responsive enough. It was a time of trial and discovery.
All right, I suggest we move on to the second part.
Thank you all for your attention. I think the next part will be easier and, in some ways, more interesting. It's closer to our everyday life. What do I want to emphasize? All the factual information I intended to share is presented in the first part. What follows now touches more on things like who said, what, to whom, motivations and behind-the-scenes reasoning. Because we all understand, when an event happens, it was people who made it happen. But why they did it isn't always clear. So, part 2. Why did the USSR go along with this imitation? And why did the USA? Let's start with the USSR. Here, everything is decided by the highest political leadership. That's a given. There may be recommendations from below, but the decision always comes from the top. Khrushchev preceded Brezhnev. Before Khrushchev, and including his time in power, the prevailing belief was that being first in space meant a real chance to win the competition between the two systems. I remember the newspaper articles from that time. They really did focus on space achievements first and foremost. Khrushchev is credited with the quote, "Do not surrender the moon to the Americans." Was that a real thing? Absolutely. A moon landing still sounds like something out of myths and science fiction, even today. But the moon flyby was real, both back then and now. So yes, Khrushchev said, "Do not surrender the moon to the Americans." That reflects a kind of state-level thinking. But under Brezhnev, the attitude changed. Again, don't assume Brezhnev alone was to blame. The shift happened across the entire leadership. Of course, the General Secretary agrees with some things personally and follows the consensus on others. There's an interesting quote from the book, "Why Didn't We Go to the Moon?" by Vasily Mishin, Korolyov's successor as the chief designer at OKB-1, now Corporation Energia. Even Korolyov, with his authority, would have found it difficult to work without the support of Soviet leadership. That refers to the Brezhnev-era leadership, which was already following a rather unclear policy even while Korolyov was still alive. This next part isn't a quote, it's my comment. Brezhnev never said this outright, but I believe it reflects the real stance of him and those around him, which could be summed up as, the moon can be sold for a good price. In other words, they were willing to give up the USSR's lead in the space race, to trade it away. Before we move on, and just to get it out of the way, I want to touch briefly on a topic that's gossipy and unserious, but widely discussed: personal gifts. The rumor goes, Brezhnev sold our space advantage for the luxury cars Nixon gave him. So, the topic of personal gifts. In the photo, Nixon is on the left, Brezhnev on the right. The source of the quote is indicated. A quote from Forbes, the well-known American magazine, Russian edition. These two politicians often exchanged gifts. I've highlighted often in red because it indicates this was a common occurrence. And I highlighted exchanged because of what follows. The point isn't that Nixon gave Brezhnev something, but that they gave each other gifts. It was an exchange. So, during Nixon's visit to Moscow in 1972, Brezhnev gave the American president a hydrofoil boat, and Nixon gave the Soviet leader a car. We all know that American cars are excellent, especially luxury ones. So, let's talk about what Brezhnev could have given Nixon. When it came to cars, we didn't have much to offer, and the country had plenty of other concerns. At that time, practically all of our inland waterways, rivers and lakes, were filled with hydrofoil vessels. And that was a point of national pride. The reasons were clear. The country was enormous, you couldn't build enough roads, and the climate was harsh. Water transport was very important. Here is a hydrofoil boat. We weren't the first in this field, but once we entered it, we quickly took a leading position. This is the Meteor, a passenger hydrofoil ship, preceded by the rocket. Hydrofoils are like airplane wings, but in water. When the vessel moves, the foils lift the hull out of the water, drastically reducing resistance, and the ship speeds along at up to 70 kilometers per hour. 60 was cruising speed. Totally affordable. As young specialists and students, we could easily afford to ride these vessels, even for 5-hour trips. It cost as much as a bus fare. At the World's Fair in Brussels, the Soviet Union received a major gold medal for these types of ships. The USSR developed over a dozen types of such vessels: military, passenger, and small boats. Production was several times higher than in Switzerland, which was second, and the United States, third. In terms of production volume, we surpassed both combined. A very succinct summary of our leading position in this field was published in the internationally known magazine Popular Mechanics. Citing a 2017 website. In today's world, when people hear hydrofoil boats, they first think of Soviet models. This is cited from Wikipedia, which can hardly be accused of pro-Soviet bias. There were large vessels, and there were small ones. Giving the President of the United States a bulky ship would have been inconvenient. But there were small and comfortable hydrofoil boats. 3 types: Volga, Moskva, and Strela. The photo shows the Volga, which also received a gold medal at the Brussels Expo. I don't know which exact model Brezhnev gave Nixon. Forbes doesn't say. But they're all roughly similar. So, on the left is Brezhnev's gift to Nixon, on the right, Nixon's gift to Brezhnev. I think they're fairly comparable in significance. And I actually think Brezhnev wouldn't have been too thrilled with just a car. We've touched on and wrapped up a somewhat unserious topic. Now let's move on to a serious discussion. Here, I'd like to recommend a particularly well-done episode of the well-known TV program Postscriptum from November 18, 2017, about how the détente policy at the time was connected with the moon landing. And from there, it's not far to ASTP. So, over to Alexei Pushkov.
We would like to present a version that explains why the Soviet leadership, despite knowing that the Americans did not go to the moon, nevertheless chose not to refute this information or interfere with their global triumph. The version we offer is bold, but we know that the depths of history conceal much that doesn't immediately come to light. So how can we explain the exceptionally loyal silence of the Soviet leadership regarding the Americans' unaccomplished moon landing? June 1973. In these historic footage, U.S. President Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev are seen casually chatting like old friends. The General Secretary raises a toast to the health of the American president. The heads of state smile, clink glasses, and drink champagne. Such a friendly rapport between the leaders of the US and the USSR in the early 1970s was nearly unthinkable. It was the height of the Cold War. The bloody Vietnam War was still ongoing, with the US and USSR backing opposite sides. How can we explain this sudden and unexpected friendship between Nixon and Brezhnev? The US clearly understood that it would be easy for the Soviet Union to issue a rebuttal and provide evidence that the Americans had never landed on the moon. According to Baikonur veteran Nikolai Lebedev, the Americans managed to cleverly buy off the Soviet leadership.
Here's what I'm convinced of. If we hadn't played along, this scam wouldn't have worked.
That said, the Soviet Union's silence about the American moon hoax likely couldn't be bought with even the most luxurious American cars. The USSR demanded a major payoff. Can it be considered a coincidence that in the early 1970s, right after the Americans supposedly landed on the moon, the Soviet Union began building KAMAZ, Europe's largest truck manufacturing plant? Interestingly, the West granted Moscow multi-billion-dollar loans for this construction project, and several hundred automotive companies from not only the US but across Western Europe took part. KAMAZ is not the only example of unprecedented US generosity toward the USSR. There were dozens of other projects in which the West, for similarly inexplicable reasons, invested massive amounts in the Soviet economy. One of the most significant agreements was between the USSR and Germany for the construction of gas and oil pipelines to supply Soviet natural resources to the West, signed in 1970. In addition to allowing the USSR to engage in such a lucrative business with Europe, the West essentially built those pipelines themselves.
You heard the mention of KAMAZ in the program postscriptum. But it's not the only example of extraordinary US generosity toward the USSR. Here is a list. We won't read it all, just take a look. There are 17 items from Wikipedia, listing major contracts between the US and the USSR during the détente years from 1970 to 1977. It includes KAMAZ, the gas tube deal, massive grain shipments, cargo deliveries, you name it. Altogether, 17 projects. According to various estimates, the total value was somewhere between 20 and 30 billion full-value dollars of that time. Moreover, they were technically loans, but on such favorable terms that they were essentially gifts. For example, let's say you have an empty field, right? Someone comes and says, "Would you like us to build you a chemical plant? You'll repay us with finished products." A loan? Yes, but for you it's great, you spend nothing, and now you have a chemical plant, and so on. So, what did we offer in return according to this list? Wikipedia writes, major contracts between the USA and the USSR. Everything, except the one contract I've highlighted in white, represents what flowed from the West to us, totaling between $20 and $30 billion. The one I marked in white is where we participated. It says, Apollo Soyuz. Development of docking modules. I estimated the cost myself using a simple method. In Soviet times, I managed research at a lab of similar scale with a similar number of people. We didn't produce large hardware, but many expenses were still costly. In total, 50 million rubles over 3 to 4 years was enough for such a team. Generously, I wrote down 60 million rubles. So, the USSR sent 60 million rubles worth and received $20 to $30 billion in return. Who would agree to such a deal? It means we must have offered something else.
The nature of the détente clearly shows one-sidedness. The US grants favors to the Soviet Union, seemingly without receiving anything in return. Alexander Popov, doctor of physical and mathematical sciences, believes that what the United States actually received was the Soviet Union's silent support in carrying out the moon hoax.
The following view prevailed. Forget the moon, forget our space prestige. The prospect of good, long-term, friendly relations with the United States is more valuable.
However, the love and friendship between the Soviet Union and the United States, the so-called Brezhnev's thaw, didn't last long, as we know. By 1980, the Americans were already boycotting the Moscow Olympics.
Yes, the Americans got confirmation from us. Through our silent consent, we helped them. But as soon as that goal was achieved, in terms of propaganda, American policy returned to its old Cold War course.
And this is yet another example that geopolitical exchanges with the United States cannot be the basis for a long-term strategy. Yevgeny Agashkov, Alexander Fedorov, Analytical Program Postscriptum.
We've already spoken about our position. Now let's talk about the American one. The American establishment has always had a clear and concrete understanding of the importance of leadership in space. President Kennedy, during the launch of the Apollo program, said that if we want to win the battle between the two systems, we cannot allow the Soviet Union to lead in space. One of the leading newspapers, the New York Herald Tribune, wrote, "The country that leads in space will be judged as the country with the best education, the best science and technology, and the best economic and political system overall." We agreed to recognize the Americans' non-existent space achievements. That's how it works. If someone else's prestige rises, yours, even if unchanged, drops, or even shrinks and diminishes. Yes, we gave them that prestige. And now, for 9 years, our spacecraft have been ferrying astronauts to the ISS. Our modules Zarya and Zvezda were the key parts of the ISS for 10 to 15 years. Our specialists manage all the dockings. Every ISS docking involves our specialists. Ask yourself, who is the leader in space? If you look at their clown show with their what is it? Super Heavy? Starship. A string of failures. But ask an average person on the street who the leading space power is right now, and they'll say, of course, the United States. This is what's called trading prestige. The Americans understood perfectly well that belief in the moon landings translated into belief in the rightful global leadership of the United States. And if that's the case, then the belief in the Apollo spacecraft had to be maintained. And the US essentially bought the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project. Many of the projects within ASTP were funded by the Americans. ASTP served as a tool to solidify belief in the reality of the Apollo spacecraft for many years, and accordingly, to reinforce belief in the moon landings. In fact, the US was buying its place as the world leader. The success of the ASTP affair, this is my own opinion, elevated the mythical Apollo spacecraft and, by extension, the moon missions, to the status of a sacred cow. Anyone who says the Americans didn't go to the moon is, of course, and then come the insults. In this photo, Brezhnev is receiving Soviet and American astronauts at the Kremlin after the ASTP mission. The same event you showed earlier. So, ASTP was the successful technical conclusion to the American moon hoax. But I'd say it was only the technical end, because in reality, the hoax never ended. There's been ongoing and powerful propaganda ever since. And now, forgive me, let's take a bit of a breather. So how did they deceive us? Didn't we have eyes? First, there's a psychological effect. They say if you show a black ball to a person and 10 others insist it's white, The person being tested will eventually say, well, maybe it is white. Same thing here. The footage I'll show you. We've seen it dozens, if not hundreds of times, and never doubted it. Because all the media simultaneously bombard us with messages like, great achievement, brilliant flight, and so on. So then, from readers' feedback, I saw the entire broadcast of the Soyuz Apollo flight live. That's what I was telling you. Reports were coming from Houston. There was 0G and the hatch opening, and so on. I can't comment on the hatch opening. Why are people so impressed by hatches being opened? I don't know. But as for 0G, let's take a look at a couple of examples of ASTP-style 0G. If you scan this QR code, you'll find an excellent presentation by cinematographer Leonid Konovalov, where he demonstrates the capabilities of film technology at the time. Many of my physicist colleagues pompously claim this couldn't be done with cinematic methods. They don't understand, just like I didn't understand, until film industry professionals explained it to me. Yes, it can be done with cinema. Here's a screenshot from the 1968 film, 2001, A Space Odyssey. This elegant flight attendant walks around the rotating ring, first with her head up, then with her head down. She's delivering breakfast to the pilots, and we all see it with our own eyes in the movie. Try to guess how it was done. I couldn't figure it out until someone explained it to me. The Soviet ASTP fakes were made with simpler techniques. Sometimes, I'd even say, very brazen ones. Here's the photo I showed at the beginning. Cosmonauts Leonov and Stafford in the Soyuz spacecraft. Looks great, zero gravity. You really think, yep, 0G. But in fact, it's done like this. Ask some kids, they'll gladly do it for you. My granddaughter drew this cute little picture. When I taught physics in school, I asked the kids to recreate this shot. That's the whole secret of this space somersault. This is the photo you saw at the very beginning. People tell me, prove that this isn't in space. I'm not going to prove that it's not in space. Groups of people, large organizations say, we conducted a spaceflight. Show it. For example, when they show me this photo, I say, this could easily be done on Earth. A question for you. Tell me, please, if you're in such a tunnel, wearing a jacket with an insignia instead of cosmonaut Leonov, could you, leaning your elbow on the floor of the tunnel and your hand against the wall, pose like this and greet the astronaut? The astronaut walks up, leans on the floor, and reaches out his hand. Hello, Comrade Leonov, very pleased to meet you. Everything else is just like on Earth. This is not proof of a spaceflight. Take a closer look at the footage they show you. Here, I don't want to draw any conclusion. The main conclusion has already been made in the main part. I hope this edition was interesting to you as well.
All statements have been made. Applause to our speaker.
Thank you.
So, today we listened to two parts. The list of arguments by Alexander Ivanovich regarding the technical impossibility and lack of readiness for docking, and a kind of generalization. Alexander Ivanovich, apart from the technical preparation of the docking unit, apparently, by 1975 there were other technical difficulties. Let's take a look at the technical agreement. In this case, you see an excerpt from Article 3 of the agreement itself. In short, the mission had 3 points. Carry out the flight, conduct a docking with mutual crew transfer. In 2015, for the anniversary of that event, a note was published on the website of the TASS news agency stating that special modifications of the spacecraft were made by both countries for the experiment. The Soyuz was converted from a 3-seat craft to a 2-seat version and equipped with an APAS docking unit. The Apollo was supplemented with a docking adapter module of Soviet production. The length of the docking module was 3 meters, the maximum diameter, 1.4 meters, and the mass, 2 tons. It was necessary to match the life support systems of the spacecraft, which had different atmospheric environments. This is important. In Apollo, the astronauts breathed pure oxygen at reduced pressure, approximately 0.35 atmospheres. The Soyuz maintained an atmosphere in terms of composition and pressure similar to that of Earth. Now, attention. In addition, it was necessary to replace the suits of the Soviet cosmonauts, which in the atmosphere of the American spacecraft became fire hazards. They were sewn from a special fabric called Lola, for which a heat-resistant polymer was developed in the USSR in the shortest time. This fact is not hidden, but for some reason it is not publicized or analyzed. I emphasize, this is from 2015. Here is the very spacesuit in which, as stated, our cosmonauts Leonov and Kubasov flew. The same slide from the 1975 exhibition that I showed earlier. In 2011, a scientific journal of the Russian Academy of Sciences titled Science in Siberia, published by its Siberian branch, released an article on April 7 titled, Lola, for Soyuz Apollo. It's a specialized journal. The scientists reference a certain historical background. Allow me to quote a few excerpts. It discusses how American spacecraft originally used what could be called a spacesuit atmosphere, i.e., a pure oxygen environment, and provides some technical specifications. By 1972, it became clear that the Soyuz spacecraft could not use the Apollo atmosphere, and vice versa, because this would require a complete structural redesign of one of the spacecraft. Switching the Soyuz to a pure oxygen atmosphere would involve reinforcing insulation on electrical systems and electronics, and replacing many, especially non-metal, materials with fire-resistant ones. In the Apollo atmosphere, many substances that are barely flammable or non-flammable under normal conditions become highly flammable. Moreover, the rate of flame propagation increases several times over. To facilitate crew transfer between spacecraft, a docking module was developed, as we've already discussed several times. The atmospheric differences between the spacecraft remained unavoidable, with the Apollo having a more fire-prone environment. Therefore, the Soviet cosmonauts' flight suits had to be made from materials that would not burn in Apollo's oxygen atmosphere. This was a conclusion made by scientists and engineers involved in this technical effort. Attention. The article also states, the Americans had to solve this problem earlier. They used fire-resistant fibers from DuPont to manufacture their flight suits. At that time, we had no experience in producing such materials. The American side offered to supply us with the necessary amount of fabric and thread for the suits and also to share testing methods for material flammability. This generous offer was accepted. However, attention, as soon as that happened, publications began to appear in American and British press accusing the Russians of being behind in fire safety and incapable of solving the issue on their own. So, it was decided to keep the American fabric in reserve and attempt to develop our own fibers. It's worth noting that the British were actually the first to publish this, not the Americans. And we need to understand, they were stirring trouble. The phrase, "the Englishwoman is meddling," is not ours, but well known. Through this kind of blackmail, they were squeezing benefits, not so much from the USSR as from the Americans. Apparently, they were aware of what was going on and were already hinting at extracting additional leverage from the Americans. How did this end? Another quote from the 2011 article. In May 1975, the journal Chemical Fibers published information on a new highly heat and fire-resistant synthetic fiber called Lola, developed in the city of Mtistche from monomers produced in Tula and Novosibirsk. Their names are provided: an anhydride and an amine. The polymer for the fibers was synthesized by condensing these monomers. In other words, just 2 months before the flight, Soviet scientists published a report in a highly specialized technical journal, aimed at the British and Americans, stating that they had successfully solved the problem. But in essence, this meant that in Mtistche, where the polymer made from 2 monomers was developed, they had essentially managed to outdo DuPont in a very short time. This statement was made precisely to put an end to that absurd British blackmail. Another quote: "During preparations for the Soyuz Apollo flight, the Soviet side provided the Americans with a sample of the fireproof Lola fabric intended for the flight suits. After testing, both parties agreed that the material could be recommended for suit production as the best known at the time. The entire process, from initial research to delivering samples and technical documentation to industry, was completed in a short time. Let's fix this point. Aside from the docking adapter, various provocative technical details were being negotiated and leveraged by different parties to score political or technological points. Finally, I'd like to draw your attention to Article 4 of the agreement. A couple of quotes. The parties shall promote international efforts aimed at addressing legal issues in the peaceful exploration and use of outer space, to strengthen the rule of law in space and to further develop international space law, and they shall cooperate with each other in this area. Naturally, it would be very interesting to see the flight program documents to learn how exactly the rule of law in space was being strengthened and how international space law was being developed. I believe this is only the beginning of a broader dialogue. Thank you all very much for your attention. And thanks to those who watched us online.